he had become a ghost. A predator so skilled at slipping through the cracks of the justice system that for years he's been able to cross state lines without a trace. Chicago, Detroit, Texas, Atlanta. A man who's left behind a trail of victims, a pattern of violence, and yet, no conviction ever stuck. 20 crimes. Each one worse than the last. Yet every time, the system let him slip through. This time, he picked the wrong child, one whose father wasn't just any man, but a retired detective who had spent years hunting ghosts like him. What happens when a predator finally meets someone who won't let him slip away? Who helped him evade justice for so long? What were the secrets that allowed him to continue his spree? But here's the twist. The chase was on, and the monster had no idea that his past was about to be dragged into the light. But would it be enough to stop him before it was too late? Before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments below. Marcus Hale, 38 years old, an African-American man whose face is a familiar sight in the shadows of every major city. A man who has turned criminality into an art form, one that the system simply cannot touch. He's not just another petty criminal. No, Marcus is a predator, a man who knows the system better than the system knows him. Fake names, stolen IDs, burner phones. He keeps his past, his movements, his crimes hidden, wiped clean, and untraceable. With every new city, he reinvents himself. Detroit, Chicago, Atlanta. With each crime, Marcus had perfected his trade, never leaving a trace. But there was one thing he couldn't escape: his insatiable thirst for power. Robberies in Detroit violent, calculated. He terrorized businesses, breaking in under the cover of night. Drug deals in Atlanta swift, ruthless, done under the radar. And in Chicago, he was a master at assault, leaving no witnesses behind, only fear. There were never fingerprints. He wore gloves, always. He used bleach to wipe away anything that could link him to a scene. Stolen vehicles, stolen identities, everything he touched, he twisted. Marcus's signature? A trail of destruction, followed by complete and utter vanishing acts. Communities terrified, and yet, the police couldn't track him. They were left empty-handed, unable to get close enough to make a case stick. But the real danger Marcus posed wasn't just his ability to hide it, was what he saw when he looked at people. He didn't just steal from others, he took their lives, their peace, and their safety, and he didn't care. For Marcus, people were disposable victims, pawns, in a game where only one thing mattered: his power. He got a thrill from the secrecy, the control, the satisfaction of knowing he could disappear, reappear somewhere new, and nobody would ever be able to hold him accountable. This wasn't about money. It wasn't even about revenge. This was about control. And the thrill he felt every time he slipped through another crack in the system was something only he understood. But Marcus Hale wasn't invincible. He'd made mistakes before, and as his crimes escalated, the cracks in his mask began to show. One mistake, one slip-up, could bring him down. But even though the system was failing him, Marcus was growing more confident, more dangerous. He had learned how to manipulate the law. He knew how to cover his tracks better than anyone could imagine. He knew exactly where to strike, where to disappear, and when to reappear. The police had a limited window to stop him, and the more they tried, the more he seemed to slip from their grasp. At first, he was just another criminal, someone who did what he had to do to survive. But as his power grew, so did his need for more. He learned how to operate in plain sight, how to disappear and come back with a new face, a new name, a new identity. Every time he thought the system was catching up, he simply slid back into the shadows. But there was one crime, one that would expose everything that no one could predict. This was the crime that would finally force him into the spotlight, but only after he thought he'd escaped for good. If you think it's time to put an end to this broken system, hit that subscribe button. Only the accomplice and corrupt systems will ignore it. Comment, "No more loopholes," if you're standing for a justice system that holds criminals accountable, and not just the ones the system chooses to ignore. Meet Detective Alan Brooks, retired after 2 decades of service with the Chicago Police Department. He'd seen it all: the murders, the robberies, the heartache. He had been a part of every corner of the city's darkest stories. But after he hung up his badge, Alan thought he was finally free from the violence, the nightmares, and the chaos. He thought he could live a peaceful life, shielded from the horrors of his past. But in truth, the darkness he had seen in his career would find its way home. Alan had faced the worst criminals in Chicago, but he never expected that the greatest threat to his family would come from the shadows of his own past. Alan wasn't just a detective, he was a father, and to his 7-year-old daughter, Mia, he was everything. She was his world, his anchor, after years of chasing bad guys and solving crimes. She had inherited his curiosity and love for adventure. Every night, after a long day of work, he would read her bedtime stories, making sure to tuck her in just right. Her laugh filled their home. Her excitement over the little things like her first day of school or the excitement of birthday balloons was the bright light in his life. Alan's heart belonged to Mia, but would the world he had tried to leave behind come crashing back into their lives? Alan and Mia shared a bond that was unbreakable. He had been a single father for years, and every sacrifice he made was for her. Mia was growing up too fast, her school days slipping by in the blink of an eye. He cherished those moments of innocence. He promised her that, no matter what, she would be safe, that nothing could hurt her. But for all the criminals he had caught, the dangerous men he'd put behind bars, Alan never imagined that one of them, the worst one, was still out there, quietly watching from the shadows, waiting to make his move. He had always been able to read people, predict their next move, but this time, he couldn't see it coming. Little did Alan know, the darkness he had fought for so many years was closing in on his daughter, and it would only take one mistake to change everything. Alan's life had been about doing the right thing, fighting for justice. He had witnessed so much tragedy in his career that the moments with Mia became his escape. She was the reason he retired early from the force. It wasn't because he wanted to sit back and relax. It was because he wanted to protect her. He knew that the world wasn't as safe as it seemed, and he didn't want her to grow up in a place where danger lurked around every corner. But no amount of preparation, no amount of vigilance, could have prepared him for what was coming next. Mia was about to become the target of the very man Alan thought he had left behind, and the worst part? He had no idea he was already too late to save her. It was an ordinary day, one of those peaceful, almost perfect afternoons where everything felt normal. Mia had just finished school. Her backpack, slightly too big for her slender frame, bounced against her back as she walked down the familiar path toward home. It wasn't far, just a few blocks from her school in Naperville, Illinois. The sun was still out, the sky clear. The bustling sounds of the city and neighborhood hummed in the background. It was the kind of day where parents never expect anything bad to happen, but sometimes that's exactly when it does. Mia had no idea that, as she walked home, her life would change forever. And in that moment, neither did her father. But everything was about to shift in a way they could never have anticipated. Mia's footsteps echoed as she strolled along the sidewalk, unaware that a set of eyes were tracking her every move. A white van, unremarkable at first glance, sat parked just a little too long on the side of the road. A man inside his face, hidden behind the wheel, watched Mia. He waited, patiently, knowing the right moment would come. She passed by, oblivious to the danger that lurked only feet away, and in that instant, she vanished. Mia Brooks was walking home on a street she had walked 1,000 times. Yet, today, she would never make it home. The moment she disappeared marked the beginning of a nightmare, one that would haunt her father forever. The first sign that something was wrong came when Mia didn't return home. Alan, who had been looking forward to spending the afternoon with his daughter, noticed the minutes ticking by, then the hours. At first, he thought it was just a delay. A child being a child, maybe stopping to talk to a friend, maybe distracted by something along the way. But as time passed, that uneasy feeling began to creep in. He checked his watch again, and then the panic set in. Every parent's worst fear is to lose sight of their child. But Alan had no idea that the worst was already happening. His daughter was being taken, and he had no idea who was behind it, or why. Alan's first instinct was to go looking for her, but he realized he needed help. He called Mia's friends, checked with the school, made a few calls, and tried to calm his racing thoughts. But still, no word. He reached out to the local police, a nervous pit growing in his stomach with each passing minute. They quickly mobilized, but by then, the minutes had turned into hours. A team of officers was dispatched to comb the neighborhood, and as they checked the street, they made a chilling discovery. A white van, parked in a quiet corner, with no one inside. The officers flagged down a nearby security camera operator and asked if any footage could be pulled. Mia's disappearance wasn't random. The police knew it. Alan knew it. But the question remained. Who would take a child in broad daylight? And why her? What was the connection? The footage was grainy at first, but there, plain as day, was the white van, caught on camera driving slowly behind Mia. And then, as the video played on, they saw it. A tire screech, an abrupt stop, and the van pulling up alongside her. The doors flung open. In a flash, Mia was grabbed, dragged inside, and the van sped off. The footage cut off before they could get a better look, but the damage had been done. Mia had been taken, and now every second counted. Who would take a 7-year-old girl without any communication, without a ransom note? And why? What had Mia Brooks become a target for? Alan's worst nightmare was just beginning, and he had no idea that his own worst enemy was already right in front of him. The search for Mia had stretched over days, and with each passing hour, the hope of finding her alive began to fade. The police had scoured every corner of Naperville, every back alley and hidden spot, but there was no sign of the little girl they were desperately trying to find. Then, just as hope was nearly gone, the worst news possible came. Mia's family's worst fear was realized: her body had been found. But what they discovered next would be more horrific than they ever could have imagined, and it had nothing to do with a simple abduction. The discovery came when a pair of officers on the outskirts of Gary, Indiana, stumbled across a grim sight: Mia's lifeless body, discarded like trash, lying in the overgrown grass near an abandoned factory. The officers approached carefully, dreading what they might find. When they saw her, they immediately called for backup, but the damage had already been done. The place was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Her body was almost untouched by the elements carefully placed, almost too perfectly arranged in a way that seemed deliberate. Her body had been discarded, but the brutal precision with which it had been handled suggested this was no ordinary crime. Whoever had done this, they knew exactly what they were doing. The initial examination by the coroner confirmed something far more sinister. Mia's body had been violated in ways no child should ever endure. There was no sign of physical abuse, no marks on her skin to suggest any struggle, no bruises, just a lifeless body. But the most horrifying part? Mia was missing a vital organ. Her kidney, removed with disturbing precision. The surgical skill involved in the operation shocked the coroner. It wasn't the work of a random criminal. This was calculated. This was someone who knew what they were doing. Who could have done something so horrible to a little girl? And why? What could be the motive behind such a chilling act of violence? The FBI was quickly brought in, and after several months of painstaking investigation, they uncovered a chilling truth. Mia's death was part of a much larger, more terrifying network. An international organ trafficking ring that spanned across multiple states. The network had operated under the radar for years, using children as the primary victims for organ harvesting. They targeted vulnerable families, snatched their children, and sold their organs for a fortune. The FBI began to connect the dots, and it became clear that Marcus Hale, the man who had evaded justice for so long, was at the heart of it all. His crimes now stretched far beyond the initial reports of robbery and assault. He was a monster, using his knowledge of the streets and his ability to manipulate the system to fuel his dark desires. The investigation had just taken a terrifying turn. The face of a career criminal, the man who had been slipping through the cracks of the justice system for years, was now the prime suspect in a case that spanned across multiple states. Marcus had not just been a petty thief or a drug dealer. No, his crimes had reached a level so depraved, it made the public recoil in horror. The evidence that was uncovered tied him to at least 20 other abductions across the country, each one more gruesome than the last. The authorities were no longer dealing with just an abduction. They were dealing with a serial offender, a ruthless man who had not only been taking lives, but selling them, piece by piece. But who else was involved in this operation? Who else had been helping Marcus evade capture for so long? And most chillingly, who would be the next victim of this twisted network? This is where it has to stop. If you can't stand watching criminals like Ryan slip through the cracks again and again, hit that like button. Let's make sure this story doesn't become just another forgotten statistic. Share this with someone who needs to know, because no one should turn a blind eye to injustice. 3 years. For 3 long years, Marcus Hale had been a ghost. His name whispered in the darkest corners of crime-riddled cities, but he was untouchable. No one could find him, and no one could stop him. Detective Alan Brooks, haunted by the brutal murder of his daughter and driven by the need for justice, refused to let go. Alan's fight wasn't over. No badge, no desk job, no retirement could hold him back. His mission was personal. And the monster who took his child would pay the price for every crime he'd ever committed. Despite being officially retired, Alan could not and would not leave the case alone. He couldn't walk away. His heart ached with every passing day without justice for Mia, and each time he thought he might get closer, Marcus slipped away. The frustration burned in Alan's chest, a fire that only grew stronger. Alan wasn't just hunting Marcus anymore, he was hunting something darker inside himself, the grief, the rage, the unbearable weight of loss. Alan went off the grid. He reached out to old connections agents still in the field, informants still in the know. He convinced them to form a small, off-the-record task force, using the very criminal underworld Marcus had slipped into as his path forward. They followed his trail across the country, Cleveland, Detroit, Atlanta. Each time, a dead end. Marcus taunted them at every turn. He left symbols, a piece of jewelry here, a photo there, messages that meant something to him. He wanted them to chase him. Alan followed the symbols, pulling him deeper into Marcus's twisted web. The deeper Alan went, the closer he got to losing himself in this search. Every day, the lines between the hunter and the hunted blurred. The crime scenes painted a grim picture. Dilapidated warehouses in Cleveland, a rundown motel in Detroit, a trap house in Atlanta. Each location was meticulously cleaned, every shred of evidence wiped away. But the deeper Alan dug, the more he realized how much Marcus had studied them. He had become a master of evasion, a ghost who could vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but fear in his wake. But for Alan, this was more than a manhunt. This was his personal reckoning. As each day passed, Alan's obsession grew, gnawing at him like a disease. But would this relentless pursuit push him too far? Would the chase finally break him? Alan spent sleepless nights in dark corners of cheap motels, constantly chasing down false leads. He was close, now he could feel it, but the pressure was starting to crack him. His colleagues were concerned. They saw the toll it was taking on him, both physically and mentally. Friends, family, even his old department began to pull back. But Alan? He couldn't stop. He wouldn't, not until Marcus was behind bars. Alan wasn't the same man anymore. The man who had been a loving father, a respected detective, was slipping away, becoming just another victim of Marcus Hale's reign of terror. Each lead felt like a false hope, 1 step forward, 10 steps back. Marcus was an enigma, a ghost who was always 1 step ahead, using the same tricks he'd used to escape the law all these years. But Alan had learned something along the way. Marcus wasn't just hiding. He was playing a game, taunting them with pieces of himself, like a twisted version of hide-and-seek. And Alan knew it. He couldn't stop. He couldn't give up. For 3 years, Marcus Hale disappeared into smoke, until the night he slipped. The chase had lasted for years, endless, exhausting, a game of cat and mouse that stretched Alan's mind and body to their limits. But now, this relentless pursuit had brought him to the brink of a breakthrough. The drug raid in East St. Louis was their chance, a tip-off that finally led them to Marcus Hale. He had been spotted in an abandoned building, surrounded by the underworld he had cultivated for so long. The moment had come. Would this be the end of the chase? Or would Marcus slip away once again, like he always did? As the task force descended on the building, tension crackled in the air. Alan's heart raced, not just from the anticipation, but from the weight of everything he had lost, everything he had fought for. They moved quickly, the sound of boots on the cracked floor echoing as they approached the door. It was the moment they'd been waiting for, but Alan knew, he knew in his gut, this wasn't going to be easy. Marcus was dangerous. He had always been dangerous. Marcus had evaded them for years, but now he was cornered, or so they thought. The fight wasn't over yet. They burst through the door, weapons drawn, but the room was empty. Empty, except for the faint sound of footsteps behind them. Alan spun around just in time, Marcus. The man who had haunted his every waking moment, who had stolen his daughter, his peace of mind, his faith in justice. And now, here he was, standing in front of him like a ghost with a smirk. Marcus bolted. Without a second thought, Alan ran after him, his breath ragged, his mind focused on one thing: stopping him. Marcus was faster than Alan anticipated, and he leapt over fences, ducked behind crates, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. But Alan was faster. Every step brought him closer to Marcus. Every heartbeat echoed in his ears. And then, the moment of truth. A bullet cracked the air, the sound of it ringing through the alley like a warning. Alan ducked behind a dumpster, heart pounding, the adrenaline surging through him. He pushed himself to his feet, charging forward once again. It was a desperate race, with Marcus ahead, always a few steps away, but Alan was determined. This was it. This was the moment when it would all end. He had spent years chasing Marcus, but now he was closing in. There was no way out for Marcus this time. And then, Alan did something he hadn't done in years. He let go of everything. The fear, the doubts, the weight of his past. He was no longer just a detective. He was a father. A father who had lost his daughter to a monster. Alan tackled Marcus, sending both of them crashing to the ground. They hit the pavement with a sickening thud. But Alan didn't let go. He didn't hesitate. He needed to do this, needed to make Marcus pay for everything he had done. Alan's handcuffs clicked, loud in the quiet of the alley, echoing in the deafening silence that followed the struggle. It was over. Or so he thought. They had caught a killer, a monster who had terrorized so many. But as Alan locked those cuffs around his wrists, something in Marcus's smile told him there was more to this than anyone could have imagined. Marcus Hale smiled a slow, deliberate grin that made Alan's blood run cold. "You think you know me?" Marcus said, his voice low, almost mocking. "You haven't even scratched the surface." For a moment, Alan's mind went blank. What did that mean? What more could there possibly be? Marcus was arrested, cuffed, and dragged to the waiting squad car. The task force celebrated their victory, but Alan couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Yes, they had caught Marcus Hale. Yes, they had stopped him for now. But what if the darkest secret of all was still hidden, locked away where no one could find it? The air inside the interrogation room was thick with tension. Alan sat across from Marcus, who was now shackled and silent, his expression unreadable. The team had finally captured him, but the truth, as it often does with criminals like Marcus, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Forensics had begun their deep dive into Marcus's life, combing through his phone, his computer, his hard drives. And what they uncovered left everyone speechless. What they found, hidden, encrypted, would rewrite everything they thought they knew about Marcus Hale's crimes. And this time, no one was prepared for what would come next. The hard drives were retrieved from Marcus's hideout, a seemingly ordinary set of digital files, but they held secrets that were anything but ordinary. The files were encrypted, but after hours of cracking the code, a horrifying truth came to light. Marcus Hale wasn't just a petty thief or a violent criminal. No, he had a much darker secret hidden beneath the surface. There, staring back at the investigators, was a list of 20 previously unsolved disappearances. Children, teenagers, young adults. All victims of Marcus Hale, victims no one had even known were connected until now. 20 victims. But the true number was still unknown. How many more had he taken? How many had been buried in places no one had thought to look? The police couldn't believe what they were seeing. For years, Marcus had been evading justice, slipping under the radar with each new crime. But now they knew the truth. It was worse than anyone could have ever imagined. Marcus had been living a double life, and it was more twisted than anyone realized. He wasn't just robbing and assaulting. He was targeting the most vulnerable, taking lives, and leaving behind no trace. No bodies, just the missing. The more they dug, the more it became clear that Marcus had been building his very own hidden graveyard. But Marcus wasn't talking. He smirked, sitting there in silence, like he was enjoying the chaos he'd caused. He wasn't even worried about getting caught. But the truth? It was staring them in the face, and they still hadn't found it all. Despite the damning evidence on the hard drives, Marcus said nothing. He didn't react, didn't flinch. He just stared back at the detectives with that same eerie, calculating look in his eyes. It was as though he knew his fate was sealed. But there was one thing that the detectives hadn't expected. Behind his silence, something even darker was hidden, something far more sinister. They weren't just chasing a criminal, they were chasing a ghost, a shadow that had been haunting them for years. While Marcus remained silent, the police continued their search of his property, digging through rooms and walls, hoping to find anything that could help them piece together the full extent of his crimes. Then they found it. Hidden inside the walls of his abandoned house, they discovered trophies. Not the trophies you'd expect from someone like Marcus. Not money or valuables. No, these were much darker. These were personal mementos, pieces of lives he'd stolen. Photos, jewelry, clothing. And one item, a small, worn teddy bear, was linked to a young girl who had been missing for years. A girl who had never been found. It was a child's toy, soft and delicate, still in remarkably good condition, but it was the connection it held that made it so chilling. This teddy bear had belonged to one of Marcus's victims. That teddy bear belonged to a girl who had vanished without a trace. She had been one of Marcus's earliest victims, but she wasn't gone for good. She wasn't dead. The investigators stared at the toy in disbelief. They knew this wasn't just some piece of sentimental junk. This was a clue, a direct connection to a child who had gone missing all those years ago. And then it hit them. The girl wasn't dead. She had been taken by Marcus Hale. The realization struck like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just a cold case, it was a living nightmare. Could this girl still be alive? Could Marcus Hale have kept her somewhere all this time? Was there another victim, still hidden in the shadows, waiting to be saved? The team scrambled to put everything together. If one child was still alive, then there could be others. There was no time to waste. And the truth, as it always does, would change everything. What they thought was the end of Marcus Hale's reign was only the beginning of a much darker story. Now that the truth is out, what happens next will expose the true darkness of a system that allowed this to continue. How could someone like Marcus evade justice for so long? If you believe that the system must change and that no more lives should be taken by people like him, hit that. Subscribe. Only the criminals would want to keep this system intact. Comment, "Justice over corruption," if you're standing for a change that will stop more tragedies like this one. The courtroom was packed. The world was watching. But the weight of what was happening inside that room wasn't just the trial of Marcus Hale, it was the trial of an entire system. A system that had allowed a monster like him to slip through the cracks. A system that had failed not just one family, but dozens, maybe even hundreds of families. Now, the families of his victims were no longer silent. Their voices echoed through every corner of the country. Their pain, their outrage, was being heard. And finally, it was Marcus's turn to pay. Despite the conviction, despite the life sentence, something felt broken. The case wasn't over. Not for the families, not for the public. There was still a question no one could answer. Inside the courtroom, Alan Brooks, the man who had devoted his life to catching Marcus, sat quietly in the back. He watched as the prosecutors laid out the case, methodically revealing the full extent of Marcus's crimes. One by one, the witnesses spoke, their voices quivering, their hearts breaking as they relived the horror of losing someone they loved. Each testimony was more emotional than the last, and each family member had one thing in common: they wanted answers. Why had it taken so long? Why had the system failed them? Each victim's family was in tears. But there was a deeper question that lingered in the air. Was this justice? Or was it just a hollow attempt to fix what had been broken long ago? The air was thick with tension as the final arguments were made. The prosecutors painted Marcus Hale as the monster he truly was, a predator who had eluded justice time and time again. They spoke of the young lives he had destroyed, the families left behind to pick up the pieces. On the other side, Marcus's defense team did everything they could to minimize his role, to shift the blame. They tried to paint him as a victim of circumstances, of a broken system. But no one was buying it. For all the efforts to defend him, there was no denying the truth. Marcus Hale was a monster, and now he was going to pay the price. But would the sentence be enough to bring real closure to the victims? Finally, the jury delivered its verdict: life without the possibility of parole. It was the verdict everyone had been waiting for, the punishment that seemed to fit the crime. And yet, as Marcus was led away in handcuffs, a part of the audience felt nothing but emptiness. Justice had been served, but at what cost? And yet, despite the conviction, despite the justice served, families continued to ask one haunting question: how many children could have been saved if the system had acted sooner? How many lives could have been spared if someone had cared enough to stop Marcus Hale before? The public erupted in both relief and anger. On one hand, there was satisfaction. Marcus Hale, the predator who had terrorized so many lives, was finally behind bars. But on the other hand, there was deep frustration. Frustration that it had taken so long. Frustration that so many victims were lost along the way. And even though Marcus was convicted, the pain of losing those children, those young lives, was something the families would never get back. Marcus was locked away, but the haunting question remained: how many more would fall victim to the system's broken promises before the real change happened? Protests erupted across Chicago, Springfield, and beyond. Parents, activists, and citizens alike took to the streets, demanding reform. They called for changes in the system that allowed someone like Marcus Hale to continue his reign of terror. They wanted the loopholes closed, they wanted real accountability, and they wanted answers. How could this happen? How could one man evade justice for so long? The outcry didn't stop with Marcus's conviction. It grew louder, and the question that no one could ignore still lingered in the air. How do you lock away a nightmare that haunts every parent's heart? The families of Marcus's victims fought for legislative change, working tirelessly to ensure that no one else would fall prey to a predator like him. Emma's Law, a new piece of legislation, was introduced. It aimed to close the loopholes that had allowed career criminals like Marcus to slip through the cracks and wreak havoc. But as the law made its way through the legislative process, the public began to ask, was this enough? Could new laws really make a difference? Or would this story just become another statistic, another failure of a system that hadn't been fixed for decades? The battle wasn't over. Even with Marcus behind bars, the families and the public had learned the hard truth. The system wasn't as strong as it seemed. And even though the verdict was reached, justice didn't feel whole. The pain didn't end with Marcus's conviction. For those families who had lost their children, justice was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. A fight for real change. A fight for accountability. And a fight for every life that was lost along the way. The dust had settled, but the pain, the heartbreak, was still raw. The trial was over. Marcus was locked away. Justice had been served. But what had it really changed? For Alan Brooks, the fight wasn't over. His daughter, Mia, was gone, but her legacy was just beginning. While justice had been delivered, the emptiness of losing Mia would never be filled. But in the ashes of this tragedy, Alan found a new purpose. A purpose that would echo through the lives of countless others. Alan couldn't just walk away from this. His daughter, Mia, had been the victim of a broken system, one that had allowed Marcus Hale to commit crime after crime without facing the full consequences. He couldn't bear to think of how many other children, other families, had suffered the same fate. And so, Alan dedicated his life to making sure that no other parent would ever experience what he had. He founded the Mia Brooks Foundation for Missing Children, a foundation that would not only provide support for families of missing children, but would also push for laws that could prevent this kind of tragedy from happening again. Alan's fight had just begun. Mia's death wasn't the end of the story, it was the start of a movement. And it wasn't just about keeping predators like Marcus behind bars. It was about changing a system that had let so many slip through. Alan didn't stop there. He tirelessly lobbied for Mia's Law, a mandatory cross-state crime tracking system for missing children. He knew that the lack of coordination between state lines had allowed predators to operate without fear of being caught. He was determined to make sure that the system wouldn't fail any more children. He knew that in order to make any real change, he had to push through the bureaucratic red tape and fight against the very system that had allowed Marcus Hale to slip through for so many years. And so, he spoke at rallies. He gave speeches in front of Congress. He gathered petition after petition, pouring his heart into a cause that, in a way, had stolen his daughter's life. The tears of the families, the anger of the public, it was all being channeled into something bigger. Mia's Law wasn't just a piece of legislation. It was Alan's promise to the world that his daughter's death would not be in vain. A candlelight vigil was held every year in Mia's memory. The flickering flames symbolized hope, the hope that no more children would be lost to the darkness. Through the glowing lights, Alan's voice became a steady anchor. His speeches resonated across the country. He spoke of Mia's beautiful, innocent life. He spoke of how her smile would never fade from his memory, even though she was gone. He showed pictures of Mia's drawings, her innocent renditions of the world, a world she should have been a part of. Her voice, her laughter, captured in home videos, still played in the background as the world began to change around her loss. The public's outrage had turned into a movement. Mia's law had a real chance of passing. But more than that, Alan had found a way to honor his daughter's memory. He had given people hope again, even in the face of unspeakable grief. Could Mia's law truly change the system? Could it be enough to save the children that were still out there, still vulnerable to predators like Marcus Hale? The impact of the foundation and the movement continued to grow. Families, advocates, and lawmakers came together to ensure that something like Mia's death would never happen again. The Mia Brooks Foundation became a beacon of light, a voice for the voiceless. But the fight was far from over. As Alan stood before the crowd at another rally, his voice filled with raw emotion, he turned to the memory of his daughter. He whispered, almost to himself, "Mia, this is for you." The hardest part of the fight was realizing that no law could ever bring Mia back. But with every change, with every victory, Alan knew he was one step closer to honoring her memory. In the final moments of his speech, Alan shared Mia's final drawing, one that she had made shortly before her death. It was a picture of a family holding hands, walking into the sunset. The crowd fell silent. That drawing was now framed, hanging in the foundation's headquarters, a constant reminder of the innocent life that had been stolen and the legacy that was left in her place. And though the fight was far from over, Alan had something to hold on to, something that would drive him forward every day. Mia's life, though short, had left an imprint on the world that could never be erased. Mia's life was short, but her impact, endless. The words echoed in the minds of everyone who heard them, a final tribute to a young girl whose light had been snuffed out too soon. But as Alan stood there, fighting for the future, he knew that Mia had made her mark. Her story, her legacy, was something that would never fade. As the crowd erupted in applause, Alan stood tall. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. Mia's fight for justice had become his fight too. And that fight wasn't over. Do you think justice was truly served? Or do you believe that the system failed too many times before Marcus Hale was caught? The fight for change isn't over. It's only just begun. Thank you for sticking with this heartbreaking journey. Your support, your voice, matters more than ever. We need to continue fighting for justice, for the victims, and for those whose voices have been ignored for too long. If you believe that no one should slip through the cracks like Marcus Hale did, make sure you subscribe so we can keep raising awareness, keep exposing the truth, and keep pushing for a system that truly works. Don't forget to share this video. Someone needs to hear this story. And together, we can change the narrative.